Talking about Egypt to a variety of people, not the least of which the editor of the Daily Caller, Tucker Carlson, joins us now. Tucker, good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen.
I started this program by saying that Egypt is Barack Obama's 3 a.m. call. Remember Hillary Clinton saying, would he be ready? Let me ask you, do you think he is ready?
Well, you know, I'm quick to pass judgment on the president. I think he's done a poor job of running the country. On this question, I give him every benefit of every doubt because the solution is not so clear. All of us root for the downfall of dictators or authoritarians like Mubarak. On the other hand, you know, what's the option? And it's tough. I mean, you don't want the Muslim Brotherhood in charge in Egypt. It's not so simple as having an election, a free and fair election, given the chance the majority of Egyptians might choose an authoritarian or totalitarian government. And so, what do you do?
Well,
I don't know. I've got to say, I think it's a very, very tough situation for this administration. I'm sure they've mishandled it. I do have qualms about some specific things they've done, but in general, you got to say it's tough.
All right, let me ask you something. It is true that there are no clear choices and probably no good ones, and we've had a couple of callers chime in this morning and say the best thing for the president to do is to still say nothing and kind of work through intermediaries. All that having been said, would it make any sense for this president to say, as we watch the events unfold in Egypt, one thing you can be sure of, the United States will not tolerate an Islamic fundamentalist government like Iran in Egypt? I mean, to me, as a voter, somebody who is obviously allied one way or another, but somebody who wants some leadership here, that would at least tell me, well, the president is leaning away from a situation that could be much worse than what we have now.
I think the president doesn't feel that way, most likely. I don't think he sees Islamic governments as the threat that most Americans do. I can't be sure. I do think it might not be the wisest thing to say that in public.
Wow.
Right? I mean, making the United States the story in Egypt can't be a good thing for the U.S. or for the Egyptians. So I agree with your first point, which is it's best to do whatever you're going to do as sub rosa as possible. You know, work behind the scenes. I personally think, I mean, if I'm going to be like completely honest and cynical about it, it's probably the best for Mubarak to stay, at least for a while, until the situation calms down. You know, you never want the mob in control. And one of the problems with Americans in foreign policy is they have a lack of imagination, and they think that a totalitarian government is the worst it can get, and that's not the case. The worst it can get is chaos. Chaos is the worst thing. More people die, you empower the craziest element when you have chaos. I mean, it's the lesson of Hurricane Katrina in Iraq and every other natural and man-made disaster. You want to stay away from a mob rules situation above all. So I think propping up Mubarak in the short term, engineering behind the scenes to the extent we can, some kind of transfer of power to a non-lunatic. And by the way, I'm not sure Mohammed al-Baradei is the guy.
No, I don't think so at all.
Right. And by the way, we're about to do our story meeting at the Daily Caller, and I'm going to assign the story, which, you know, al-Baradei is beloved by the left in the United States, as you remember.
Oh, sure.
Mostly because he's anti-American.
Yeah.
How many examples can you think of, right off the top of your head, of so-called moderates who step into a situation like this and become loonies over time? You know, I mean, look, starting in D.C., Marion Barry was a moderate when he was elected, if you'll remember, in 1978.
A moderate tells an extremist movement, we've got a chump at the head of the ticket. Let's go for it.
Exactly, and the fact that he's already won the backing of the Muslim Brotherhood, as apparently he did yesterday, is not a good sign. But one thing we know for certain is al-Baradei is not pro-American, and we have a responsibility as we conduct our foreign policy to think about what's best for the United States. That's the whole point.
And he's not pro-Israel either.
Let me ask you a larger philosophical question then. This is something we've been talking about for years on this show, and that is democracy in the Middle East. Is it worth our time? I mean, this was essentially part of the Bush doctrine, which was to spread democracy in the Middle East and everything will be better in the long run. But when you look back, and you mentioned, we don't really know how the people of Egypt would vote. We've seen people in Lebanon vote for Hezbollah. We've seen the Palestinians vote for Hamas for leadership in a true government. Is it in our best interest to have democracy in the Middle East?
Well, in some cases it is, and in others, maybe most, it certainly is not. I mean, the idea that a democracy is an end in itself is one of the more ludicrous tenets of the Bush foreign policy, in my view. Mm-hmm. And look, I'm no liberal, but I thought that was a mindless position. The idea that democracies never attack their neighbors, that democracies are inherently peaceful, is stupid. You can think of lots of democracies that have attempted democracies that have devolved into dictatorship and indeed been a threat to their neighbors, starting with Nazi Germany. So, let's just be real here for a second. The question is not how do you get the government? The question is what kind of government do you get?
And quite honestly, it's a lot easier for terrorism to thrive under democracy than it is under a dictatorship.
It might be, depending upon the circumstance, but again, the point is, what's the outcome? That's what you care about. What's the outcome? Do you wind up with a benevolent government that allows the maximum amount of freedom, that is pro-American, that is not a threat to its neighbors? That's the whole point. And if you arrive there through democratic means, all the better. We can all feel good about that. If you arrive there through other means, fine. But the point is that you arrive there. It's not good enough to have a bunch of people wandering around with ink on their thumbs celebrating the vote. That's meaningless. That's just a process. And I think the State Department and certainly the Bush administration lost sight of that, and I hope that we're a little more realistic now, but we'll see. I don't know.
So what do you make of the fact, and this is just apparently breaking this morning, that Mubarak has apparently reappointed a new cabinet? I mean, if you're in the streets of Cairo right now, knowing what you know about Mubarak, is that going to do anything, or is that something that you suppose is perhaps unfolding behind the scenes with the clear faith and credit of the U.S.?
What people forget is that those in power tend to stay in power. This is one thing we learned during impeachment, right? When
Absolutely.
Clinton was gone by Friday, right? But the truth was he was president. And unless he chose to leave, there was really no way to make him leave. And the same, I don't mean to compare the elected U.S. president to a Middle Eastern dictator, and I'm not. I'm just making the point that it's naive to think that Mubarak, because there are a lot of people angry in the streets, has some obligation to leave. He doesn't. He's been there for 30 years this year. He arrived in that position because his predecessor was murdered. He's a tough man, and he's weathered a lot of storms. He's dealt with Islamic lunatics for 30 years.
Well, I'll tell you what it is kind of telling me, and this is, I think, the linchpin, is if he's able to reappoint the cabinet with impunity, then he still has control over the military, and exactly. The way the military goes, so goes Egypt.
That's exactly right. Chairman Mao's most famous quote, political power does grow from the barrel of a gun, and if you control the weapons, you control the government. That's the truth. Whether or not the New York Times editorial page prefers Mohammed al-Baradei, you're the guy. And I just have a lot of trouble believing that after 30 years of holding on to what has to be one of the toughest jobs in the whole world, that Hosni Mubarak is going to say, you know what, you're right, you don't care for me, I'm moving to Stade.
Yeah.
I just don't see that.
One of the things that Chairman Mao didn't have to deal with that is the Internet. And it's amazing how the Internet has played a role in what's happening in Egypt, what happened in Tunisia, and what happened in Iran last year. And you wonder about where that's going to go in the future. I mean, it could even make its way into China. And, we could be seeing this for quite some time to come because of the power of people being able to read other opinions and give their own opinions.
Amen. I think what's striking about this story, what's unfolded in the last week, is how precarious our control over the Internet is, we being citizens.
Right.
The government of Egypt just shut down the Internet, and it took about 2 minutes. And they also shut down the cable, Al
Jazeera.
The cell providers, yeah. Exactly right. And so, I don't know, I'm not a paranoid person, I'm not a militia member, I'm not stockpiling weapons and food, though I probably should be. But it does raise the question, are our networks, to what extent are they controlled by the government? I don't know.
Well, the problem with the Internet...
Crazy to ask that question.
Right.
The problem with the Internet, at least as I see it, is it creates all kinds of options, but very few solutions. And that's what Egypt is confronted with right now, particularly people who are in the streets.
Well, of course, because it's always... revolution is pretty simple. This is the lesson of the activist left. It's pretty easy to wreck stuff, to tear stuff down, to say this institution is unjust and corrupt. Of course, it's very simple to destroy. Change is easy, is the bottom line. Building things, creating something that's enduring and fair and decent is very hard, and it's done incrementally over a long period of time. The Internet is not as good at that. It's
right.
Very good at mobilizing people for change, whatever that is.
All right, Tucker. Good to talk to you as always. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Tucker.
You guys got me worked up.